United Bible class.
Yes, sir. We got a lot of work to do, man.
Man, yes. Yeah, like you said, the harvest is plentiful.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Is Waller back over there? What did he do? Go over and went to sleep?
Oh, man, my fault. I'm finna take it with me.
You guys dressed mighty quickly.
I forgot I had it on.
It is, right?
Okay, Brother Waller, you want to come on around?
Yes, I can. I just want to make
No,
sure.
we want to do what we want to call this ministry in the streets. What we want to call this?
Yes, sir. Pleasure. Always good to see you.
The same thing.
Pastor Walker,
Yes, sir.
God's will to see United Bible class.
Brother Waller, come on over and have a seat here.
Okay. Thanks again for
Good.
having me over here.
And I tell you, why don't you take that book, Brother Waller, and give it to him, and he might be able to get a shot of it. And you don't have to, you know.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's better. Because I can give.
Are you promoting the book?
Well, yes,
Yeah.
I am. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Okay. Okay. All right. Let me get in here. Okay.
Okay.
Let me see.
Bringing hope.
Count to 10. 1, 2, 3,
Bringing hopes to the
4,
street.
Yeah,
5,
bringing hopes to the
6,
streets.
7,
Bringing
8,
hope.
9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. Let me scoot it up.
Might be able, yeah. Can you push you up?
Okay.
I think the chair has something that will allow it to give or something like that.
On his, yeah, it's something over here. I don't know, but my man probably can.
And you can tighten it so it won't move.
Yeah. My man, let him. You can handle. You can.
Yeah.
No, he's.
It looks like it's kind of back.
If you want to bring it up a little bit.
Like it's back a little bit this way instead of up. Even with us. Do it.
Oh, you can bring the seat up.
Okay, let me stand up. Okay.
Let's try it now.
Let's try it now.
But his weight, I think his weight will push it on down even.
No, I'm talking about for
Back as far as.
Back there.
No,
yeah.
it needs to stay right so I can
Oh.
get him in the shot.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'm back again. Here I go, brother. Let me see if I can put my feet. Is there anything that can let down here? I'm guessing I'm all right. So I can turn this way?
Yeah, you want to sort of, could you move it back forward?
The back part?
Yeah, back
I'll make it work though. I can sit up if I have to.
Yeah,
I can sit up like this if I have to. Yeah.
Have your book
Now,
here,
Rick
so
Waller,
camera
is that right?
Yeah, Ricky.
Ricky.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Ricky Waller.
You got a book that you presented to us last time.
I did. Yeah, that book is,
Okay.
yeah.
So what we want to call this, according to Pastor Walker, we want to call this Bringing Hope from the Streets.
Bringing hope to the streets, to the streets. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is bringing hope to the streets. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about some of the activities in street ministering, Pastor Kay Walker and Rick Waller, two individuals who have quite a bit of information in reference to what is going on in the streets today. And Pastor Walker, I think that you came with other individuals, and we've had an opportunity to talk about some of the activities that you've been involved in the streets, as well as Rick Waller. We've had Mr. Waller on here before, but let's have the two of you. For those individuals who might not know either you or Mr. Waller, to give us some information about your background, your education, and some of your experiences. And you should take about 3 minutes, Pastor Walker, to talk about some of your background, education, and experiences. And after that, Waller will take a couple of minutes to talk about his background, education, and the book, I think, that he has with him. And then we'll be out of that first segment, and then we'll go into that 8-minute and next 10-minute segment. But first, let's start with you, Pastor Walker.
Okay, well, once again, Dr. Haney, good morning, and thank you for allowing us the opportunity to be on your show. I'm Pastor Kelvin L. Walker, Associate Pastor at Fairfield Missionary Baptist Church under the leadership of my senior pastor, Howard E. Jones, Jr. Born and raised here in Nashville, Tennessee, two good parents that raised me right, but I went wrong. But at the same time, you know, I did get to teach and I did get to understand. I got the knowledge. I got kicked out of the public school system, you know, around the beginning of my 10th grade year. I was kicked out. I wasn't a desirable character during that period of time in my life. Ended up in the United States Navy as a result of being involved in a shooting where I shot someone, and the judge sent me to the military as opposed to sending me to reform school at the time. And of course, I got in there and just using drugs and everything like that. Got out of there and ended up incarcerated in the state prison system and everything. Had some college studies at Tennessee State University during that period of time after my release from the Navy. Between being released from the Navy and being incarcerated, I did do some studies at Tennessee State University. While incarcerated, I did some study with Trevecca East Campus Prison Program as well, trying to major in business and stuff like that, and some theological stuff I studied in there as well. But I got out unreformed and continued in my criminal lifestyle and stuff. And back in 1986, God stepped in my life, intervened, pulled me out of that, called me in the ministry. And that's what I've been doing for the last almost 33 years now. It brings me to this stage right now, Dr. Haney.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine, Waller, you can say about the same thing in reference to why you're here this morning, bringing ministry to the streets. Let's talk about how you became who you are today, Pastor Waller.
Thank you, Dr. Haney, for allowing me to be here. I want to thank my partner, Pastor Kevin L. Walker, for inviting me to come. My background is that I grew up in Preston Taylor Projects in West Nashville. Went to Moses McKissick, very innocent. And by the time I ended up at Washington Junior High, the schools became integrated. I was in the 7th grade. I was transferred to W.A. Bass, and I got caught up into the drug game. And I was a great basketball player, according to what people would say. And then I ended up going to Cone High School, as far as I went. And while I was there, I was deep into the streets. I became the supplier of my community by the time I was in high school. And so what happened was I quit school, and the gym teacher would see whoever could play whatever type of sports. And I didn't know he was probably watching me, and all of a sudden, I'm not in school anymore. I believe he probably went to the principal and whoever he had to go to say, you need to get that boy back in school. So to make a long story short, I ended up going back to school, and I played basketball for them on up until the 12th grade, and I didn't go no further. And I was educated in the streets. I was taught well what it's like to be in bondage. And that was because of the wicked schemes of the enemy and how he captured my mind and taught me how to do his will. And so after I went through that process, I know now that what he meant for bad, God can get some good out of it. And that's why I'm here to talk about how I was released from the bondage that controlled my life for so many years.
And in other words, Pastor Walker, I think I could say this in reference to your story as well as Waller's story. God is good.
Yes.
And
Yes,
he will do some wonderful things.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that I might not have been in the streets, quote, as such, but I know what God can do, and I know that he has intervened in my life just as he intervened in your life.
Yes, I believe that.
While we might have traveled different roads, I think that we're all at the same place in reference to what we're doing today. And I just want to thank you up front, the two of you, and we'll talk about other things after we have our first commercial break. We'll come back and we'll have 2 segments for you and Pastor Walker to talk about ministering in the streets. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
You got to wait.
Hey, sometimes
Most of us, when you grow up like that, you
do what you
things do. Walking down the street, somebody say, "Here come the police." Everybody run.
Everybody take off. Yeah,
that's the going thing.
That's right.
They got to run.
That's right. And so it's good for folks to hear our testimony.
Oh yeah, it is.
Because they know that anything can be overcome.
Yeah.
So
Oh
you
yeah,
have to
without a doubt.
understand,
Yeah.
And that God is the source of it all. That's what I try to be consistent in reference to everybody I talk to. We're talking about what God has done to them.
That's right.
Know it.
Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Pastor K. Walker and Minister Rick Waller, Rick Waller,
Yes,
Mr. Waller, and as long as I've known you, I still get stuck
It's all
on
right.
Rick.
Yes, sir.
Pastor Waller,
Yes, sir.
both talking about bringing folks into the gospel, into Christ, and talking about relationships with God, and how people, for the most part, that are in the streets don't have an opportunity until people like yourselves go in and help provide that opportunity, and that opportunity can often be just the knowledge of God.
Right.
And people are looking for that today. Let's start off, Waller, by having you to make some statements in reference to not only how you came here, but I think that you've got a book that you've spent quite a bit of time in terms of writing it and et cetera. And I know the story of the book, but I think it's well enough for our audience to know something about that book.
With that book, I really appreciate it because God knew I needed some help. And that book was a part of the help that I needed to reach out and let people know that, that God is real. And for those who knew me from my past, had a hard time believing that my life had changed, but they allowed me to continue without trying to force me to go back into what I just came out of. And so, with knowing that I'm toiling out in the streets because I know hurting people were in the street, because I came from that. And not only that, being that I became a supplier, so I was distributing drugs because I had learned some things that street life had offered. And when I got captured, I didn't know I was doing harm to my community. But when God brought me out, what he reminded me of, that I had a right to go back out there and to let people know that there is a way to escape. There's a scripture according to 2 Timothy chapter number 2, verse 26. He says, and that they may come to their senses and escape the snare, the trap of the devil, having been taken captive by him to do his will. See, I used to do his will, and I was faithful at it. I don't know everything about street life, but I've had my share of what it would do to one if he's lured into the power of darkness. He have to call on some help. And so in the midst of the book, God knew that I loved to get high. Not only was I a supplier, I used to get high. I was a heroin user. I was on it for 20 years of my life. And in the midst of doing all of that, it was like a state of no return. But one day I heard my mother, when I was a little boy growing up, she didn't read the Bible, according to my knowledge. I never seen her do that. But I always remember that time when I used to hear her say from time to time, Lord, have mercy on me. And those words, when I grew up, I thought about those words. And then in between the time she said that, along the way, she would say, thank you, Jesus. And then that really dawned on me. I said, now, that was a time when she called on it. And I know that they say he may not come when you want him to, but he's always on time. So I didn't know all about those cliches or anything, but I'm still dealing with my mother's saying. And sure enough, I just decided to say, I wonder would he have mercy on me? And I went to him, and he allowed me to come in just as I was. I went into the church. I snorted heroin in the church because somebody told me that you can come as you are. I'm not talking about clothing. I'm talking about the trouble that's in your life. And so that's what I did. And since God knew that I loved to get high, he was my witness that I had been getting high for all those years. So I don't pretend like I'm from the streets. I have a stamp of approval from the guys and people that was in the street that knew I played the game fair. Mm-hmm. But yet still, coming out is hard to believe that a person can get out of that. So God said, Ricky, I know you love to get high, but I'm going to introduce you to the greatest high of them all. And if you don't like it, you can always go back to the one that you love the most. Mm-hmm. So I had a taste of what he offered me. I took one hit of being free. Now I've been delivered for 27 years in a row. So he gave me a book that's entitled Still High, No More Getting High. And see, when people learn about what it's like to just stay high, and my friend Pastor Kevin Walker had just talked about how you end up being incarcerated in prison for doing things because drugs would make you do things that you probably wouldn't even do had you not gotten on the drug. And that was me. And so then I discovered in the Word, it said in Psalms 34, verse 8, it said, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusted him. See, I had to learn how to trust in the Lord, and the Lord didn't tell me when I went into the church, stop doing them drugs. He allowed me to continue to go in the bathroom and do drugs until I got to a point where I said, I got to have a talk with him because I'm tired of coming in this church doing these drugs. I feel like I'm disrespecting him. So I was going into the rest area for my last time, I thought. Went in there and I opened my pack up, as I normally would do. And before I took that hit, because I heard someone say just a little talk with Jesus will make everything all right, so I decided to have a little talk before I left out that door. And I said these words. I said, God, I said, I'm tired of coming in this church disrespecting you. But I heard a voice so powerful say, you're in the right place. And see, that's what people in the streets are afraid of. They think that they're doing so wrong that they don't want to come into a church, so you have to take it to the streets and allow them to know that there's evidence. The word says, let your light so shine before men that they will see your good work and then glorify your Father in heaven. So a lot of times you don't even have to say anything. People who know you will watch you and then come up and ask you how you do that, man.
How'd you get over?
How did you do that, man? And I have to share with them how I was able to get through this, man. So it wasn't easy, but good things don't come easy. See, it's a good thing to see our communities free from that drug. And I know there's a God that'll get in a person's trouble with them. Now, I've learned a little bit about the Word of God now, so I can't deny him. He don't want me to be ashamed of him. When I saw in there Psalms 46 and verse 1, when it says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble, God got in my trouble with me and showed me how to get out of it. So why would I be ashamed of him when I was doing the devil's work out there and I wasn't ashamed of him? I'd done whatever he told me to do, when he told me to do it, how he told me to do it, and why he told me to do it. Because he gave me an instruction that when I was in his kingdom, I had to do his work. But when I called on the almighty and all-wise God, and he brought me out, so why would I be ashamed to take it to the streets in which I came from?
Well, I think the only thing we can say, Pastor Walker, is that this has been quite inspirational.
Yes,
you
sir.
see, because people who've been able to overcome difficulties, and certainly everybody might not have the same problem, but everybody has problems.
That's
And
right.
So I
That's
think
true.
that what the two of you have given us this morning has been a way that people might be able to reevaluate their situation, and no matter what it might be, to know. And I think listening to both of your stories, I know that if you've been able to overcome
Yes, sir,
what
without
you've
a
talked
doubt.
about, God is good.
Yes,
and of
he
course, let me thank the two of you, and let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning. I'm getting to see, well, I'm just running all these segments.
I know it.
We got a
That's
10
all
minute,
right.
okay?
Yeah, we
We
got it.
got it. We come back.
That's all right. That's all
We'll come
right.
back. because we still got a title.
Oh, yeah, we still got
I can welcome back to the third segment. We're going low.
I was going to say something, but then I wasn't sure.
And that's what I try to divide it into 6, 8, and 10.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're going so good, the information.
I got you.
I started to say something, but then I said, doggone, I ain't sure.
I wasn't sure either.
And I blame myself because I knew y'all did 3, but I didn't know this one was going to take 3. That's my only problem. That's why I couldn't say nothing.
We got 10 more minutes on this
Yeah,
segment. Okay, so what we'll do is simply introduce it again and come on.
Yeah.
Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Pastor K. Walker and Minister Waller in reference to some of the activities of bringing people into the Word of God in a real sense. And I think the two of you have demonstrated, Pastor Walker, how that can be done. And so let's take this last 10 minutes to give you and Minister Waller an opportunity to make some final statements in reference to how you feel that people might be able to overcome, and if there are any secrets that might be to that, we want to reveal those secrets today. Let's start again with you, Pastor Walker.
Yes, sir. You know, Dr. Haney, when you talk about the streets, you know, people, it's easy to get a visual of this, somebody standing on the street corner or lurking in and out of some dark alley somewhere. But and it is that. But at the same time, it's more to it. It's a mindset. It's an environment, you know, that we find ourselves in, you know, because of whatever the situation, circumstance, and a lot of times, you know, poverty is one of the underlying factors that attributes to people being caught up in what we call that street life, which is a life of hustling, a life of crime, a life of drug addiction, a life of alcoholism, a life of thievery and the like, you know, and all types of immoral or things that, you know, people do in turn in that with that mindset that creates that particular environment, you know. And what's important is the Bible talks about, you know, how can they hear, you know, without a preacher?
That's right.
And when you talk about a preacher, we're not talking about somebody that just stands behind a podium.
Go ahead.
We're talking about somebody that has come into a relationship with God, has the knowledge of God, and have experienced the love of God, and is going out sharing that love with others. So anytime you're ministering and speaking to others concerning what God has done for you, then what you're doing, you are a herald of the gospel, and you're letting people know. And basically, what you're doing, preaching, is just telling the good news.
That's what preaching is.
Yeah, that's what it is, telling the good news. So if I'm out there in the streets and I'm telling you the good news, I don't have to be a minister or ordained minister or what have you. I just need to be somebody out there telling the good news about what God has done for me and what I know that he can do for you if you give him the same opportunity to act in your life in the same manner in which maybe I've given him the opportunity, or somebody else has given him the opportunity to act and function in their lives. And you find out that you can overcome situations and obstacles by simple acts of obedience, you know, being obedient to the word that you hear, and people's lives has been transformed just because somebody, you know, I pray a lot of time, Dr. Haney. People say, you know, pray for such and such a person. And my prayer is, God, send somebody across their pathway that they'll listen to, that they'll hear. Because, see, I might cross their pathway, and even though with my experiences, I may have experienced some of the same thing that they've experienced, they may not hear me. They may hear me. But at the same time, they may not hear me. But there's somebody out there that they will hear, and that they will adhere to the words that they're speaking and begin a cycle that would change their lives. But we got to get it out there to them. You know, if you don't take it to them, many times they don't get it, you know.
Okay, Pastor, end us for today. You've got about 5 minutes. And I was watching your face as Pastor Walker expressed some of these ideas, and not only do you agree with them, but you seem to say to me, push it a little further.
Yeah,
and I
I'm
think you
excited
got
about
books and all of those things that push it a little further.
Yeah, I have one, that's up under my belt. I got it locked in, and that is Pastor Kelvin L. Walker. I remember 24 years ago, I had 3 years that I had been delivered. And all the time, people would compromise when they're out there talking about God. They'll talk about everything else, but they wouldn't talk about God. And I kept watching this brother for those first 3 years, that he didn't compromise. Everywhere he went, he made known of God. Me being a brother that was from the streets, see, I wasn't completely free in my mindset. I had stopped using drugs for 3 years, but I still wanted to use drugs every day for the 3 years that I was free. I still wanted to use. So I kept just watching this brother. He just kept speaking about God. Anywhere he would be, he would acknowledge God. And what I liked about that is that the word does say that. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding. But I like verse 6 when he says, in all of your ways,
Yes, sir.
acknowledge him. And then he would do that. And I just came to him one time, and I said one day, I said, man, I said, look, I said, I'd like to be able to just connect with you, man. I said, because you have a sense of just, you got a love for God. He accepted me. He knew from my past that I was still doing certain things, which I was still selling drugs at that time. But after talking with him from time to time and the humble way that he presented what he had to share with me from what I talked to him about, he never told me, he said, man, you got to stop selling those drugs. What he recognized is that I had just got hooked up with God, and I'm allowing God to help me help myself. And so for 5 years, I wanted to snort heroin until one day I was sitting on the side of the road on 16th and Joe Johnson with a small Bible and a dictionary. And I heard the power of the voice speak to me and said, look up the word junkie. Because I used to hear in the streets, once a junkie, always a junkie. Now here I am, I'm free for 3 years, but that mindset that I heard in the streets is still lingering. And I want some heroin anyway. I've been off of it, for 3 years, but I was on it for 20 years. And I said to myself, I said, well, I haven't had any drugs in 5 years at that time because I'd moved on up. But God was my witness. He knew I wanted to take that hit. I opened up that dictionary and looked in there, and it said, junkie, slang, a narcotic addict. Well, I felt like it summed it all up. It's a narcotic addict, so it didn't mean any drug. But I knew that that couldn't be the case with that drug that was controlling me. I had tried marijuana, I had tried cocaine, pills, and all those things, but it was nothing like that heroin that controlled me. And so it said ESP. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I found out that it meant especially, and it says one using heroin. And at that time, I didn't want heroin no more after I heard, he said, I didn't make you to be no junk. See, when I found out that information, it had to do with God working through somebody. And this is the man that God worked through, that I was inspired by watching him speak about God. And suddenly I ended up becoming a minister in 1998, because the strange thing about that is that now I got to go deal with my peers out in the streets and things, knowing good and well that I didn't talk about God when I was in the street. I didn't know him. I didn't pretend like I knew God. And see, that's one thing that God don't want us to do, or he didn't want me to do, is pretend like I knew him. But he wanted me to come and get to know him, and that's what I did. And so after I stopped running, I came into the ministry in 98, and I've been taking the message everywhere I go. I don't compromise. I reason with people, and I have to do that because God had compassion upon me. And when you have compassion upon the people, you have a love for the people who are out there still hurting. And that's why I take it to the streets and anywhere I go, because I used to take drugs anywhere I went. If I went to the penitentiary to visit my friends back when I was in the streets, I went in the penitentiary with drugs. And I would do drugs in the penitentiary. If I'm going to court facing a charge, I would go to court with drugs. I'm talking about the controlled substance that was controlling my life made me take drugs everywhere I went, because being a supplier, I always had drugs. So it was strange to become free. And that's why I'm so thankful today to let people know that it wasn't easy for me.
Last statement, Pastor Walker. 30 seconds.
I would say to people, man, if God has touched your life, then and shows you and special love towards you, then you're obligated by God's love touching your life to share that love with other people. Otherwise, man, what's the point in God touching your life if you're not going to take what God has shared with you and share with other people so that they too can come out of that darkness into the light as well as you have? In other words, you can't put your light up under a bowl, man. You got to set it up on the hill and let that thing shine,
Go
man.
ahead.
Give other people an opportunity to come into this relationship that we have come into as well. Can't just sit back and say, well, I go to church, man. That ain't good enough. You got to take the church that you are outside and into the communities and share church.
Okay, well, let me thank the two of you for bringing that excellent information, Pastor Walker, and so that we might be able to know more about Waller, know more about what is going on. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning. might have to get something straight to hold it up.
So, Doc, how you doing?
Hey, I'm trying to get through the third show we have.
Oh, okay. You actually had more time than you.
Oh, I tell you,
Yeah.
Yeah, it won't work.
it won't work.
Yeah. Well, if you could hold it, would it matter? And just refer to it from time to
Get a
time.
mic check from you.
Big part?
Mic check. Just count to 10.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is Jamestown, 1619, the very beginning. And of course, we have with us to talk about the establishment of Jamestown and some of the things that grew out of such establishment, Dr. Lewis Baldwin from Vanderbilt University. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Thank you.
And to once more say how delighted we are to have you with us this morning because
Delighted to be here.
Well, you bring us such excellent information, Dr. Baldwin. I think you have sort of a historical touch in your gospel, your religious ministry.
Thank you.
In a real sense, and we appreciate that.
But
today, what we'd like to do, Dr. Baldwin, is to talk about the very, very beginning of the African American experience in North America, recognizing that Jamestown certainly is not the first establishment where Africans were found in the Americas, but we do know that Jamestown played a significant role in the establishment of slavery in the American colonies that would eventually be known as the American colonies, and so we look at that as the very, very beginning.
Exactly.
And so what we'll do, Dr. Baldwin, is to have you to give us some information in reference to your background, your education, and some of your experiences, and then we'll have an opportunity, even during that segment, to start talking about the establishment of Jamestown and what it meant from 1619
to 2019,
celebrating in a real sense almost 400 years of the black presence in North America.
That's right.
Okay, very good.
Well, I grew up in Camden, Alabama, Wilcox County, Alabama, as I'd said many times before. I studied in the public school system in Wilcox County or Camden, Alabama. Graduated from Camden Academy High School in 1967. From there to Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama. I was there from 1967 to 71, graduated with a BA in history. From there to Crozer Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York, where I received the MA in 1973 and the MDiv, Master of Divinity, in 1975. And of course, I left Crozer in 1975, began my PhD studies at Northwestern University. And of course, I completed the PhD in 1980. From that point, of course, I taught at Worcester College in Ohio. From there to Colgate University in New York. And of course, in the fall of 1984, I took a position at Vanderbilt University, professor of religious studies. And I was at Vanderbilt from 1984 to my retirement in 2013.
And have produced how many books, Dr. Baldwin?
Well, I've authored 6 books on Dr. King and co-authored a couple and co-edited a couple of books on Dr. King and also edited a couple of volumes for a total of 14 books. So most of my career as a scholar has been devoted to research and scholarship on Dr. King.
You know, Dr. Baldwin, every time you come to us, I try to get that information from you because I think it's such an encouraging part of what we do here, to encourage folks to get out, read, research, write, become more knowledgeable in reference to the the American experience in a real sense. And I think we're going to talk about the African and the American experience today when we talk about the establishment of Jamestown.
You certainly can't separate them.
Can't separate them, not at all.
Exactly,
you see.
exactly.
And even though slavery would be established at Jamestown with the introduction of Africans, we do know that slaves were not indentured servants.
Exactly.
And of course, I think that
now some historians use those terms. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. When Africans were introduced to America, they were viewed differently and treated differently.
Exactly it.
And you had de facto slavery before you had de jure slavery.
That's right.
You know.
Yeah. And so what we want to do today after our first commercial break is to allow you to talk about the establishment of Jamestown and some of the things that were associated with that for the next 8 minutes. And then we'll have a 10-minute segment and we'll be able to cover most of that information. But in the meantime, we'll just deal with Jamestown during the second segment, which is about 8 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity to make some suggestions in reference to slavery, racism, and all of those other things during the last 10 minutes.
That's right.
And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. And as you reminded me, 1619, 2019, 400 years.
And then, you know, at the last segment, we can deal with what's going on in terms of celebrating, commemorating these events, and what churches and other institutions might do.
Very good.
Because I've seen very little interest in that date among churches outside of Virginia.
That's right. That's exactly
institutions. It's not a state.
That's right. That's right. And I think this will give you an opportunity. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin from Vanderbilt University, and he's given us some information in reference to the establishment of Jamestown in Virginia in 1619. Of course, Dr. Baldwin, I think that that is a very, very important date in terms of the introduction of Africans into North America. So let's talk about it from that perspective.
Well, we know that in August of 1619, the first 20 Africans landed in Virginia in August 1619. And according to scholars like John Hope Franklin and Lerone Bennett, that was the beginnings, as you said, of the African presence in English North
America. Very good.
Exactly. So 1619 is an important date. It's actually a year before the Puritans landed in America, because as you well know, Jerome Bennett wrote this book before the Mayflower.
That's
and
exactly
he emphasizes the fact that African slaves were here before the Puritans. And we know that among those 20 Africans who landed in Jamestown in 1619 were the names Antony, Isabella, and Pedro. And we know that Isabella and Antony married, and they actually produced the first African born in the English colonies, a boy by the name of William Fuqua, they named him. So you have to go back to 1619, I think, in order to understand what happened subsequently, because you have the foundation of black history in America. Black history begins there in 1619 at Jamestown. And of course, we know that you have the development of slavery. By 1661, Virginia had established a kind of statutory recognition of slavery. It became legal. But even before it became legal in 1661, it was in fact slavery in 1619, de facto slavery, before you had de jure slavery. So I think we fail to recognize that if you're going to understand the history of black people in America, you got to begin with 1619, 400 years ago. And August of this year will represent, as you well know, the 400th anniversary of black presence in America.
Very good. And that is information that a lot of folks might have known, but I think somewhere along the way we forgot that.
Exactly. A lot of us, we've read scholars like Ivan Van Sertima, who argues that blacks were here before Columbus. We know that blacks came over in the 1400s. They were explorers. They accompanied the French and Spanish explorers. Some were with Columbus, the Italian explorer. But when you're going to talk about the establishment of slavery, or the establishment of black presence in America, 1619
Jamestown is the place.
Jamestown is the place that you got to look at, and 1619, August 1619, to be more specific, is the date.
Talk about that, Dr. Baldwin. I mean, why is that date significant? And give some things in terms of your historical scholarship that will sort of bring all of that information together for people who might not be familiar with some of the things that we're talking about.
I think it's important in so many ways. First of all, if you're going to understand the impact of black people on the development of America, you got to look at 1619, because that was the moment, I think, at which black people began to have this powerful and indelible influence on the history of America. So you're not just talking about black history, you're talking about American history. Also, from that point in 1619, there would always be a question about what does it mean to be American? What is democracy? So I would argue that at that very point, black people became the critical issue in American history, because when you had the enslavement of these 20 Africans, we have to remember that the Puritans and others who came over, they were in search of freedom. They were moving away from conditions in England and other parts of Europe where they were enslaved and they lacked freedom, so they came to America to experience freedom, to experiment in freedom. But Africans were forcibly brought here from a situation of freedom into a situation of enslavement. So I think you begin to have the question of what is America? How can we profess on the one hand to be a land of freedom while holding certain people in bondage? So I think with 1619, we have the beginnings of these kinds of questions about what does it mean to be America? How can we, on the one hand, reconcile our professions and our values of freedom with the enslavement of certain segments of the American population? So I think, again, that represented a moment, August 1619 represented a moment when blacks began to have this powerful and indelible influence not only on America, but on what it means to be American and what is the nature of our democratic values. How do we define our democratic values, our democratic institutions, our democratic traditions?
And it was a long period that Africans were slaves from 1619 to 1865.
Exactly,
Now,
exactly. That's a long
that's
time.
a long period. You see,
That's more than 200
years.
But in order to understand the kind of institutionalized slavery that developed, 1619 is the date. You know, because at that point, not only were Africans enslaved, but you had the dehumanization of Africans. And you know, we came along with the Constitution and the 3/5 Compromise and the Dred Scott decision and all of this that occurred. You can't understand these developments apart from what occurred in 1619.
That's right. And how do you count slaves?
Exactly.
You know, are they property? Are they individuals?
Exactly.
And so what we want to do, we'll make a property and individuals.
Exactly.
And we'll just call them 3/5
exactly.
of an individual.
So that speaks, I think, to the uniqueness of the 1619 event, because you not only had the establishment of institutionalized slavery in time, the beginnings of that, but you also had a process that led to the dehumanization of African people, and we are still dealing with the legacy of that today.
Very good. And so what we'll do, Dr. Baldwin, we'll take our first commercial break. I think this is the end of this first segment, and then we'll have an opportunity to talk about some of the events in reference to the enslavement of the African during the second segment. And the third segment, we might be able to talk about what people are doing in order to recognize 1619, because we want to make it a very, very important day. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
Talking the second segment and third segment, how we are celebrating it.
Okay, very good.
The legacy of 1619.
Okay, legacy of 1619, that'll be an 8-minute
This
segment.
segment, yeah.
Yeah, 8-minute segment. Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going well. It's going well.
This will be the last segment?
Is this the 10-minute segment? Yes. Are you sure of that?
Yeah.
Okay,
the
well, you know, we've
legacy.
had some problems with that. Right? At least I've had some problems. They've not had any problems. I think it's the second segment. They said, no, it's the third segment. And then they, well, you know, we had it last time. You know, you sit up here for, you know, 5 shows, 3 segments apiece. That's 15 segments. And you forget whether this is the first, the third, or the final, or whatever, and et cetera. And then that's good.
Stand by for the third segment.
This is the final segment.
Final segment.
Yeah.
This is the final?
This is the final, last 10 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and he's giving us some information in reference to the establishment of Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Of course, Dr. Baldwin, I think you've already laid out a very, very good pattern in reference to that. Let's continue that.
Okay, we can talk about the legacy of 1619. You don't hear a lot about that. When you speak of racism, of course, that's part of the legacy in the form of white supremacy, especially. You can talk about racial polarization, because that's part of the legacy of 1619. You can talk about established class distinctions, poverty, because I think, you know, poor people came from Europe to America in the 1600s, but you can't talk about the rigid class distinctions and the separation between rich and poor without also looking at 1619.
Jamestown.
Because scholars like Eugene Genovese talks about slavery as an institution based on class, and of course 1619 I think illustrates that as well. We also talk about nativism and xenophobia in this country
Good.
today.
All right.
We
have
talk
it
about
today.
those, but we don't realize that Africans were among the first immigrants, and there were many Americans from Europe who didn't want them here, who felt that they were not born here, they were not a part of the culture, not a part of the establishment of the nation. So nativism and xenophobia, which is, of course, fear of foreigners, victimized Africans. The first Africans were victimized by that, beginning with Jamestown, of course. And also you have to take into account anti-immigrant sensibilities. We hear a lot about that today. Talk against the immigrants, Muslims and immigrants from black and brown countries. But that, you have to go back to 1619 to understand that. Because even at that time, there were Europeans who set foot in this country and established themselves in this country who didn't want Africans here.
Well, where did slavery come from?
Exactly.
Why slavery?
Exactly.
That's exactly what,
exactly. It was not until the early 19th
that's right.
century that Europeans really accepted the fact that slavery could be profitable. In the 1600s, there were questions about it, but the economic profitability of slavery
That's right.
had become evident by the early part of the 19th century, so there was a change in attitude. But in the early years, the 1600s, etc., blacks were among those who came to this country who were not fully accepted. They were not fully accepted after slavery also. But in those early years, there were arguments about whether or not blacks were human,
All right.
whether or not they had souls. So